There's no secret about this, that part of the crisis of truth, which I will get into in some more technical ways later, but I think part of the crisis of truth is a crisis as well of institutions. And one of the things that I think we can say about John Paul II is he's not only been an abstract teacher, he's been a man who has really tried to take a number of institutions by the horns and do something with them. All of us are familiar, of course, with the attempt to reform Catholic colleges and universities through the promulgation of Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, from the heart of the church, and how difficult that's been in a place like the United States to implement, where we have, 230, 250 so-called Catholic colleges and universities, and very few of those institutions, and usually the institutions that I like to refer to as the pariah schools, and we know what they all are, very few of them take seriously his encouragement to combine faith and reason, his encouragement that Catholic institutions be primarily Catholic and sort of professional and training schools in a secondary capacity. That it has now deep roots here in the United States going back 30 plus years. Many of the boards of our Catholic institutions have divested themselves of their Catholic character. And so it's in small institutions like this that some ferment is going on. In small renewal movements around the country and around the world, that some kind of energy, some kind of Wojtyłan energy, if I can put it that way, is actually taking place. And though there are just a few of us here today, there's an old Italian saying that I like to use in these contexts. There's a saying that goes, "Siamo pochi ma buoni." There are just a few of us, but we're good. So I wouldn't neglect this, and I wouldn't just think of this as a lecture. This really goes to the heart of what Karol Wojtyła, since the beginning of his papacy, and I was a Fulbright student, as it turned out, in 1978, when Paul VI died, and then John Paul I died rather quickly, and then John Paul II was elected. So just in my own personal life, I've been connected with the way that this particular man has tried to insert something new into the world, and I think done so remarkably. So, let me turn to my remarks about John Paul II, Faith, Reason, and the Crisis of Truth. Now, when I looked at this title as I started to prepare my written text, I realized that Mike Wallacabbage must be something of a Svengali, because I would never agree to addressing so large a topic in one lecture. I mean, obviously, as John said, we could do this for years, and I mean, certainly this is a kind of a book-length topic. But I'm going to try, very sketchily and inadequately, I realize, to just lay out some of the basic propositions that John Paul II has tried to bring to this public debate about the nature of truth. And I hope to touch on kind of large-scale issues, a few technical philosophical questions, and then I want to push further. Can you hear okay out there? I want to push further on some of the categories that he brings up in a number of his different writings and a number of different things that he's done, in the hope that maybe we can get a discussion going that'll gather together as much light as possible on this vast topic. Now, the first thing I think that it's worth saying about John Paul II's conception of truth is that truth is something to be taken personally, in various senses of the word. Personally, as a Christian must take truth personally, because for us, the truth is not simply, an abstract scientific theory or some philosophical system. Truth is a person, we believe. We believe that the deepest stratum of reality is a person, and in fact, three persons in the triune God. So in that sense, a Christian approach to truth always begins in a different place than a secular approach, a purely philosophical or a purely rationalistic approach to truth would begin with. And he says this at the beginning of Fides et Ratio, the great document about faith and reason, very explicitly. And I'll just read you a couple phrases from there. At one point, he says, that knowing the truth about God tells us the truth about the human person, because obviously there's an interpersonal relationship here. And that our process of coming to know that truth is a journey. And he says about it, and I'm quoting here, "It is a journey which has unfolded as it must within the horizon of personal self-consciousness." And everyone, he says elsewhere, every human being is in a sense a philosopher, not in the technical or in the professional sense of the word, but we are all philosophers because we ask a number of questions that have been the meat and potatoes of philosophy throughout the world. And among these, he says, who am I? Where have I come from and where am I going? Why is there evil? What is there after this life? And those questions cannot be answered by the typical ways of rationality that we find in the modern world. They take us into a different kind of perspective, and one that, if we pursue it, even with the means of reason, can bring us to a profound understanding of what the truth is about ourselves and about the world. Now, one of the things that's important to understand in this preliminary kind of approach to John Paul's understanding of faith and reason is that in this understanding, in this light of revelation, we have an element that probably does not exist to the same degree in any other culture, and that is the belief that time matters. It matters to each of us individually because our apprehension of truth evolves over time. If you think about your own kind of woozy, and John Paul actually uses language like this at certain points. I mean, your kind of own woozy approach to the faith, and most people kind of go through turmoils and doubts. I mean, rare is the person who doesn't have those kind of doubts. And in a way, in the modern world, it's a good thing because it really makes us confront all the challenges that there are out there. But time matters in a Christian understanding because, first of all, as we believe, revelation unfolded through time. It's not as if God just dropped the Bible on the front steps like the Yellow Pages and said, there it is, read it, and that's it. It unfolds through time, and it's not only the book that tells us about the history of what occurred, but the concrete existence of a man named Abraham who sets out from Ur of the Chaldees on his way to the Promised Land. That journey, that kind of pilgrimage that gathers up the whole people of Israel, and then in the fullness of time blossoms out into Christianity, which truly spreads out, as the promise to Abraham is, spreads out to all parts of the world and now probably numbers something like 2 billion people. Think about that. I mean, think about the concrete existence of one man has a voice that he believes is from God speak to him and sets out on a journey, and more or less 3,000 or 4,000 years later, 2 billion people have been affected. Jews, Christians, and to a degree as well, Muslims. So time matters, and it matters, I want to say again, it matters internally to us, and it matters externally because we think that time is not just the meaninglessness of the Big Bang. It is not just the kind of blind chance of evolution whereby things come to be because they're banging up against one another and some beings survive and some don't. Time matters because something is being communicated through time as well as these more mechanical processes. Now, what I think is one of the most lovely passages in John Paul II's work, and he is a stunning writer at times, just a torrential writer at times. But what I think is one of the most delicately beautiful passages in his work comes in his latest encyclical, which is called Novo Millennio Ineuente, upon entering into the new millennium. This was formally issued in January of 2001, and as John rightly says, this aging Polak, who seems to many people to be on his last legs, issues a document which is just energized from start to finish with this view. I mean, he starts out by saying, okay, we've gotten the Jubilee behind us now. Now what should we be doing? And he proposes a whole number of different things. But there's this beautiful passage in there that relates to this question of time and the journey and the pilgrimage that all of us make. He says about the Jubilee year, "I have often stopped to look at the long queues of pilgrims waiting patiently to go through the holy door. In each of them, I tried to imagine the story of a life made up of joys, worries, sufferings, the story of someone whom Christ had met and whom, in dialogue with him, was setting out on a journey of hope." What a profound appreciation for those people who physically made an effort to come and be part of this wonderful exemplar of time that we have in the Christian tradition. Now, I'd like to look back at a time period of about the last 100 or 125 years to just give us a little perspective on where John Paul's efforts weigh in the recent history of the church. And I think that this is important because lots of us can get discouraged about the way that the institutional church perhaps seems to be corrupt. We all know about this pedophilia scandal. We all can feel that our parishes are not as dynamic as they ought to be, that institutions of higher learning, as I said before, may be a problem. Our local bishop may not be as much of a bishop as we would like him to be. But let me just point to a parallel that I think will eventually show itself to bear fruit. About 125 years ago, when Pope Leo XIII, who was probably the previous great Pope philosopher before John Paul, wrote his encyclical Aeterni Patris, I think it was in 1879. This was the document that really gave the spur to the recovery of Thomistic philosophy in the Catholic Church. Most people don't realize that Thomas was not the kind of center of Catholic philosophy going back to the Middle Ages. In point of fact, Thomas had kind of fallen by the wayside with a bunch of other things in the 19th century. And it was Leo XIII who was both a profound philosophical mind and understood the contemporary problems that he faced. I don't want to say to the same degree of genius that John Paul II has, because it seems to me that John Paul has really tackled a variety of issues that no modern pope has tackled. But Leo began that tradition of Catholic social teaching that the church has developed over the last 125 years, precisely because of his interest in this Thomist philosophy. And it was Leo who, by expressing his desire to see Catholic institutions study St. Thomas again, really started that wonderful neo-Thomist flowering that gave us Samaritain, Gilson, Mandonnet, Chenu, and a whole bunch of other names. But also gave us a way to understand the modern world in a different sense, it seems to me, a way that Catholics really began to try, at least to try to confront the full range of modern things. Now, John Paul talks about St. Thomas in Fides et Ratio. And one of the things that you might not notice if you just kind of read through it quickly and you know it's in the section about philosophy is you might not notice that he doesn't talk so much about Thomism as a philosophy per se. Obviously, he thinks it's important. He mentions in other places that it would be wrong to lose touch with this classical philosophy because classical philosophy in the sense that Thomas looks back to Aristotle and Plato and Augustine and draws them all into a kind of a synthesis. He says it would be wrong to lose touch with that because in God's providence, the church was first born into a world in which it had to confront that philosophy. And therefore, the way that it kind of began to use those philosophical categories probably has a providential dimension. And what he tends to emphasize in that document is the method that Thomas uses. And specifically what he points to is the way that Thomas was able to draw on all the then current philosophies that were out there, on Judaism, on Islam, on classical philosophy. If you've ever read any of St. Thomas, you know that one of the interesting things about him is he lays out all the positions that exist He starts out by saying, does God exist? Well, it appears not. And he lays out all the reasons why some people have said it is not so, then the reasons why it is so, and then he says, respondeo. I'm going to respond and now try to bring all these things together. I think that attempt to unite and to synthesize all truth, that confidence that there is a unity of truth, and that's a phrase from St. Thomas, and the Pope repeats that quite often. The fact that there is a unity of truth and there are not truths in physical science and truths in psychology and then truths in theology that can contradict one another, but that somehow they all must be part of one reality. That's the part of the method of St. Thomas that this Pope tries to emphasize a great deal, and I think is quite right to do so. So I would say that we can take some comfort from the fact that we've been in this problem before. A Pope has made some efforts to stimulate philosophical thought, and it had tremendous effects. And not only in the Catholic world. If you know what happened after the Thomist revival, many of the major figures, particularly Maritain, taught at places like Columbia and Princeton and the University of Chicago. Maritain gave the Mellon Lectures in Washington in 1952, which became Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. So that kind of energizing of philosophy from a Catholic perspective can even take on some secular dimensions as well. Now, there are obviously differences between the days of Leo XIII and our own. And one of the worst, of course, is that even our Catholic institutions aren't likely to be very welcoming of the way that the Pope is trying to encourage philosophers to think about truth and about the truths of faith and the truths of reason as coming together in one synthesis. But I would not say that it's impossible for these things to have an effect. As I mentioned at the outset, there are all kinds of renewal groups that are taking these things seriously. And you find that it's very much like other areas of human endeavor, where there are people who are energized and actually will do something. They can actually begin to change institutions over the time. I don't think that there is going to be a tremendous change in maybe even in my own lifetime, but John Paul II has been right about so many different things. It would be a very big mistake, it seems to me, to bet against him that he won't prevail on this issue as well. Now, let me talk about the two main obstacles, and here I'm going to be simplifying somewhat, to receiving this vision, this unitary vision of truth that exists in the modern world. And here I'm going to kind of synthesize a number of things that are in various writings by John Paul II. By the way, I've always thought it would be quite interesting if Voltaire could be reincarnated at this moment in history, because Voltaire and many of the people in the Enlightenment thought that the Catholic Church was, an outmoded and helpless institution that just would fall apart by its own irrelevance. And it always strikes me that the way that the Church comes back again and again should encourage us to believe that there are constant resurrections constantly going on within the faith, and that the gates of hell shall not prevail. Voltaire would also be shocked, by the way, that the Pope is probably the most prominent advocate of the use of reason in the modern world as well, it seems to me. But history has many odd twists and turns, and well, he'd be surprised. Now, to get at what these two main philosophical obstacles, let me read you a passage from Fides et Ratio, okay? And this is right near the middle, where he's kind of set up a problem and he's now looking to what are the solutions going to be. And he says that the divorce between faith and reason has these consequences, and I'm quoting. Deprived of what revelation offers, reason has taken sidetracks which expose it to the danger of losing sight of its final goal. Deprived of reason, faith has stressed feeling and experience, and so runs the risk of no longer being a universal proposition. It is an illusion to think that faith, tied to weak reasoning, might be more penetrating. On the contrary, faith then runs the grave risk of withering into myth or superstition. By the same token, reason, which is unrelated to an adult faith, is not prompted to turn its gaze to the newness and radicality of being. Now, to translate that into one phrase, I think that that is John Paul's transposition of the motto he has used since that day he stepped out on the balcony in the Vatican, first as Pope, "Be not afraid." It's a transposition of that attitude into the intellectual life. What he's saying here is that, I myself will throw as he did as a philosophy professor, will throw myself wholeheartedly into this sort of intellectual endeavor because there is absolutely nothing that faith can believe contradicts the truth of the faith, and that therefore that there is no threat to be seen in reason. Obviously, distorted forms of reason, the failure to see certain things can be a threat, but reason in its fullness, in its most authentically human manifestation, reason can never be a threat to the faith. And in fact, there are a couple main ways of responding to our current situation that he begins to develop. And the two things that, as I said, that I think he finds are most troubling are, one, a type of scientism, which makes all reality kind of reductive to more or less mechanical operations. Many people have really kind of come up against that limitation. It's not that people are opposed to science, but they just find that science cannot tell us the answers to those questions that I quoted from John Paul at the beginning. Who am I? What can I hope? Why is there evil in the world? What can I hope for after this life? Science, by the very way it was set up in the modern world, cannot answer any of those questions. And those questions are the questions which, as John Paul said, are the questions of every human being who is by nature a philosopher, because we want to know those truths. Now, I think one of the most candid expressions of what scientific reason has brought us to is by the astrophysicist Steven Weinberg, who formulated it this way, and I think it's quite striking. He said, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless." Right? Now, lots of people have noticed this, and very few human beings are willing to live with that kind of pointlessness in the universe. Those questions keep burning inside of us, as John Paul says. But what's the answer to it? If you think that reason is really only that kind of reasoning on the basis of scientific data, what's the answer to it? Now here's where the second great challenge, as I believe John Paul points out, and here I'm going to perhaps, I may speak for myself a little more than for him, because he doesn't quite put it this way, but I'm going to put it this way. There's a kind of postmodern, I would say, attempt to develop a truth that is true for us, or true for me. Since science doesn't seem to help us with those questions, a lot of people, and you see this not only among radical feminists or people who believe in the social construction of reality. I'm sure many of you have heard these phrases on college campuses. It also exists, sad to say, among Catholics and other Christians, that, well, reason can't help us very much with faith because faith is a gift of God, and so I'm going to believe in what is true for me. Now, as a reaction to that kind of scientism, it's understandable. But John Paul will not allow that to be the last word on the use of reason insofar as it relates to faith. And I think that what he has in mind is something like what St. Paul says when he says that if Christ did not rise from the dead, and he means that in a fairly literal physical sense, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we are the most wretched of human beings. That our faith is dependent on a existing reality, a physical reality, on that history that I described earlier, and therefore what's true for me doesn't really work. What's true for me has to be grounded in something outside of my own feelings and my own decision about what I'm going to regard as real. Now, I just want to very quickly talk about a figure that I'm sure none of you have heard of, but I'm going to mention him anyway, because I happen to be reading one of his books, and remember I mentioned how the Pope said that some people think that weak reason, like this postmodern idea of reason, weak reason perhaps will be more religious and more profound. There's a Italian philosopher who's rather prominent in postmodern circles. His name is Gianni Vattimo, who came up with most postmodern philosophers are not memorable writers, and Gianni Vattimo is one of them. But he came up with a memorable phrase that is kind of stuck in postmodern writing, and even in American universities, and it's called pensiero debole, weak thought, which he advocates, by the way. In the past, philosophers were not exactly proud of practicing weak thought, but this is now something that, because of the kind of postmodern turn, just for some people seems to be a good thing. Because if we cannot know transcendent truth, then it's only right for us to practice a weaker form of reason that deals with the realities that we can see around us. Now, curiously, Vattimo's latest book is called After Christianity. And he's doing in there what John Paul has said Christians should not do, which is practice this weak form of reason, this postmodern, it's true for me kind of approach. And I've mentioned Vattimo because he has a very curious personal history. He was a student of Jacques Maritain, and he kind of absorbed from Maritain a critical distance from certain modern ideas. But then he kind of went through the usual turn of reading Nietzsche and Heidegger, and he was a skeptic for a while, but eventually came back to some idea of the faith, and he criticizes the Pope at one point in this book. It's quite curious. He doesn't know the Pope nearly as well as the Pope knows, phenomenologists and postmodern philosophers, but he says, the Pope, he is advocating that form of reason that destroyed religiosity in the past, by which he means a kind of reason where God is viewed as kind of an object of scientific reflection, and we can never really arrive at that God with reason, or at least not reliably, because it's very hard to do. So he proposes that we use this kind of postmodern approach to Christianity. Now, one of the curious things about all these postmodern approaches is they tell you we cannot know the ultimate nature of reality, and then they tell you what the ultimate nature of reality is, because you can't know it. It's out there and you can't know it, and they begin to tell you what the human mind is. It's got its limitations, and the absolute is over there, and we can't get there. But these stories kind of tell us some things, and Richard Rorty is the past master in the United States of this sort of reasoning, by the way. So Vattimo gets himself, it seems to me, backed into this corner. And the only way that we can find our way out of this is to at least, I think, recognize the self-contradictory nature of attempts to deny that we can arrive at truth by asserting, but pretending you're not asserting another truth. Far more consistent, it seems to me, and certainly the kind of thing that the Holy Father is trying to do, without minimizing how difficult it is to arrive at absolute truth. What the Holy Father is saying is, let's recognize that we have this aspiration, that we get intimations of absolute truth somehow from God. And he mentions in particular in Faith and Reason, by the way, the first chapter of Romans. You remember that's where Paul says that the pagans departed from the truth, and this is, he says, gives rise to homosexuality, actually. They departed from the truth, and they actually like this lack of truth. But they should have known from the nature of the world that God exists, and his nature is true greatness and true goodness and transcendence. Now the Pope says about this that St. Paul is almost, and he emphasizes that, he's almost making a claim for reason that goes beyond reason's natural purview. That he's almost saying that reason can reach the transcendent. And as you know, there have been philosophers like St. Thomas who said, well, reason can demonstrate that God exists. For many of the things that we Christians believe about God, we must be open to the truth of revelation. Reason cannot tell us all of those things, but it can get us that far. Now, the Pope says it seems almost in that first chapter of Romans that Paul is claiming something more than reason can do, but at the same time is talking about some of the difficulties that reason may have. And what I'd like to do is just very quickly go through some of the problems that St. Thomas says are obstacles to the right use of reason. Because Christianity, it seems to me, relies a great deal at certain levels for philosophical truths, but in other ways has to be able to communicate truths to people other than through technical philosophical means. And this is what I've always been taken, if you look at the first, I think it's chapter 4 of the first book of St. Thomas's Contra Gentiles, he asks this question that a lot of people would probably think is a typical medieval, it's a very refined question that almost nobody cares about the answer of. And that is, he says, did God reveal things that human beings could have known by use of reason? And he says, yes, absolutely, and this is a great grace. And why is that? Well, he says, first of all, there are a lot of people who don't have the physical disposition to take up study. I have a son who's like this, by the way. Or he says, they have to deal with everyday necessities, or they're lazy about pursuing intellectual things. So, revelation helps people who are in that situation. Second thing he says is it takes a lot of effort. You've got to know a lot of things, and these are complicated questions. And Thomas says, therefore, and I'm quoting here, if the only way open to us for the knowledge of God were solely that of reason, the human race would remain in the blackest shadows of reason. That's St. Thomas, very strong believer in both faith and reason. And then finally, St. Thomas says there is a falsity in us. He says it's partly the result of the fall, it's partly because our imaginations mix, various images, and that there are various schools of thought that are out there that kind of confuse us. Now, the Holy Father is quite aware of this, and I think that when he's recommending philosophers to take on this fuller philosophical approach to the truth, he isn't expecting everybody to overcome those three obstacles that St. Thomas talks about. But what he is saying is that there is a very important dimension of our culture that if it's not cultivated by some people, will leave us in the darkness, will leave us in that twofold set of mistaken impressions that either scientific reason is the only thing that is out there, the only thing that is credibly out there, or there is this kind of hyper-subjectivism that doesn't really force us to encounter one another, and therefore we're all isolated from one another and not in contact with the truth. Now what he says as he looks back over the arc of history, he says, that's not what happened when Christianity came into the world. He says, instead what happened was, he said, when Christianity met the classical world, there was more than a meeting of cultures, with one culture perhaps succumbing to the fascination of the other. It happened rather in the depths of human souls, and it was a meeting of creature and creator that took place. That profound thing took place. So, I want to take these insights, and there are many more that we could draw out of the Pope. And I want to push just on about 3 or 4 points, and then maybe we can have some interchange with one another. First thing I want to talk about is a phrase that the Pope uses very often in Fides et Ratio, and it worries me, by the way. He uses the phrase, the autonomy of reason. Now, in the academic circles that I have studied, and you heard I have a PhD in comparative literature, where all this postmodern stuff is, it is obscured literature. There is no literature anymore for comparative literature. There is only theory about literature. And the autonomy of reason partakes in that world of this hyper-subjectivity that really never goes out to meet anything else. Now, the Pope probably uses this phrase, the autonomy of reason, 7 or 8 times in Fides et Ratio, and every time he does, I've read it many times, but as I reread it this last time, It's kind of like, the fingernails on the blackboard for me. He catches himself and he says, well, of course, the fall actually was an attempt to be full and completely autonomous. And, therefore, autonomy, there are various meanings of autonomy that exist in his mind. But he's careful to qualify this, and I think that he does. He uses that term for a rhetorical purpose. I looked this up, by the way, in the Latin to make sure indeed he said autonomia, which he does, because as I was reading through the translation this time around, I noticed, I don't know if anybody's ever noticed this before, but the salutation is, "My venerable brother bishops, health and apostolic blessing." When I saw that, I realized there's something wrong with that, and I looked at the Latin and it said salutem, which I think means greetings and apostolic blessing, and some English translator has the Pope, saying, hope you're feeling well to his fellow bishop. But autonomia is actually there. And what he means by this, and where I think this is rhetorically brilliant, is that most academics, hearing this kind of discourse about faith being necessary for the fullness of truth, are going to say, now wait a minute, in my study, we have our own discipline that's been built up over time. We generate these truths that are internal to the study, and we're not about to give that up to somebody's idea of faith. But if you read very carefully, what he's advocating there is not just any reason taking off on its own, although reason should explore all of reality. It should try to account for all of reality. That's what makes reason Catholic in the small c sense and can lead it to be Catholic in the large c sense. But he uses the term autonomy, I think, to say to people in various disciplines, yes, absolutely. Your discipline is a segment of the truth, as other disciplines are, and it's quite important that within your discipline, the practices that you use maintain the highest standards of rationality, fidelity to the evidence, and an attempt to connect those truths with all the truths that there are out there. So autonomy is something that I think we want to both affirm and also be careful about at the same time, but nevertheless affirm for certain purposes. Now, I also have some qualifications I want to introduce about his idea of philosophical pluralism. As I mentioned, he talks about St. Thomas in section 43 and 44 of Fides et Ratio, and says that St. Thomas is a very important witness because he is the guy who really believes in the unity of truth and attempted to respect both the truths of reason and the truths of faith. But he also encourages, as he practiced in his own life, that we look at other philosophical schools. And I think primarily he's thinking of personalism, whereby we take human persons as kind of irreducible entities that we know have rights, or at least we say publicly have rights, and have an ability to will freely and understand things. If you think about it, in the American founding, when the founders said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that men have been endowed by their Creator, that was a Christian anthropology that made sense. If you drop that phrase out of the Declaration of Independence, what does American freedom rest on? What understanding, what anthropology do we have? What understanding of human beings do we have that enables us to say that human beings even deserve respect or have rights? Almost nothing. The novelist Walker Percy said it's like Wile E. Coyote chasing the roadrunner, that Wile E. Coyote goes off the end of the cliff and he doesn't notice for a while, and his feet are still going. Then all of a sudden he realizes there's nothing underneath there, and down he goes. In some ways, that's the place that we find ourselves at, having lost this deep anthropology. Now, John Paul's multiple approaches to philosophy, and that personalism in particular, are quite important. He emphasizes over and over again the importance of anthropology, which doesn't mean going off to study, exotic tribes. It means understanding what the human person is. And he also emphasizes phenomenology, which sounds like one of these German things that almost nobody can understand, and even if you could, it probably doesn't mean anything anyway. Remember, Kierkegaard once said about Hegel that he was like a man who had built this vast palace, and after he was done, there was no room for any human being in it, and he had to go off and live in a little gardener's cottage on the side where human life actually takes place as opposed to this grand system. Phenomenology simply means that we look at all the phenomena that are available to us. And that doesn't just mean scientific, material interactions going on. It means the phenomena of things like love, and the phenomena of things like self-sacrifice, and meaning, and all sorts of other things that human beings know are part of what the Europeans call their life world, and we kind of call everyday life. Everyday life, even in its normal acceptance, has that openness to all sorts of truths. And if we pay attention to these phenomena that are not just, scientific truths, the Pope says we may get somewhere. Now, I want to be careful about this, though, because I think that multiple philosophical approaches, like multiple disciplines in the sciences or in the universities, is helpful, but it can also lead to a certain disorder. There's a certain kind of eclecticism where you pull pieces from everything and nothing ever really kind of gets integrated into a fully Catholic or a fully human perspective. And the Pope actually talks about the Magisterium's role in philosophical investigation. This is where I think a lot of our even American Catholic professors may part company with him, because he does want to reserve to the Magisterium the ability to say that truth seems to us to deny an important truth, either about God or human beings, which will lead to inconvenient consequences. And there's a history of this. Leo XIII, you may recall, in Rerum Novarum, was dealing with socialism, because socialism was sort of becoming the wave of the future at the end of the 19th century. And Leo said prophetically, if socialism succeeds, and socialism was supposed to be the great movement for the working class, if socialism succeeds, the working man will be the first person to suffer. And you look at the former Soviet Union and other places around the world, that's precisely what's happened. The average people who were supposed to be lifted up by socialism were actually crushed by it and eventually had to throw it off. Now, okay, he can reserve to the Magisterium the right to point out certain difficulties, but can he, this is where I think we want to help him along and perhaps develop ourselves certain ideas. If philosophical movements are too numerous, doesn't that potentially leave us with a problem of fideism that he says we should not rest content with? We will just have the faith, and there are various arguments, some of which are plausible, but we have the faith, and that's all we really care about. There's something else, I think, that has to come into the picture here. We can't be just cultural Catholics. If you don't like the term fideism, another way, I guess, to think about it is cultural Catholicism. I suppose at the end of the day, there does have to be a Catholic philosophy that will seek to unite all these different elements. In the same way that the Catholic theology may have different approaches, but at the end of the day, truth has to be one, and somewhere along the line, there has to be some, if not institution, then some attempt to integrate all these truths together. How that's going to happen at this late date and what philosophy that might be, I don't know. Number 3. One of the great additions to this philosophical discourse that John Paul introduces in Fides et Ratio and other places is that what happens outside of philosophy is sometimes as important as what happens inside philosophy for philosophy itself. That philosophers have too often neglected certain things that might actually convey to them material that would be useful for their philosophical reflections. And I think in this regard of a story that JP2 has told quite often about a Polish philosopher friend of his who was an atheist when he was sitting at his desk. But when the two of them would go up hiking in the mountains, in the Tatras Mountains near Krakow, the guy would turn to Karol Wojtyła and say, every time I'm hiking in the mountains, I believe God exists. Now that's something, when he went back to his desk again, he would not believe that God exists, but that's the kind of phenomenon that philosophers need to reflect on, and JP2 says is very important to the philosophical enterprise itself, even if it is not a philosophical concept. It's something that is part of our human, the wide sense of human existence that we have. People come to God for all sorts of reasons. Some people have great suffering or great joy and come to God. Others come to God after the death of a family member or a friend. Others after the birth of a child. These are all the kinds of things that philosophy is kind of excluded as it's become itself more mathematical and more abstractly philosophical and need to be brought back into philosophical reflection. Then there's a category of people that I'm going to read you a long quotation about. Not too long, I'm getting near the end of my time. But I can't help this. As some of you probably know, I wrote a book on the Catholic martyrs of the 20th century. In fact, Mike Crofton and I were in Rome on May 7th, 2000, when the Holy Father celebrated all the Christian martyrs, not just the Catholic martyrs, but the Christian martyrs of the 20th century, of whom there were millions. In a century in which 170 million people who were non-combatants died, there were millions of Christian martyrs as well in this century that also was a great century of enlightenment in its own way. And so JP2 says this. He says that much of our knowledge, even our natural knowledge, is based on trust of other human beings. I mean, most of us have not been in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, but we know that it's there. Why? Because we trust the people who drew the maps and tell us that it's there, that in fact that it's there. Most of us are Christians, whether we know it or not, because we trust the witness of the first apostles who saw the risen Christ. And John Paul says this about trusting other people. Now this is where, to go back to where I started out, a fuller philosophy that believes that the relationship of God and man really tells us the deepest truths is an interpersonal philosophy and is inescapably based on interchanges and trust of truths that are conveyed from one person to another. He says, it is in this faithful self-giving that a person finds a fullness of certainty and security. At the same time, however, knowledge through belief, grounded as it is on trust between persons, is linked to truth. In the act of believing, men and women entrust themselves to the truth which the other declares to them. Any number of examples could be found to demonstrate this, but I think immediately of the martyrs, who are the most authentic witnesses to the truth about existence. The martyrs know that they have found the truth about life in the encounter with Jesus Christ, and nothing and no one could ever take this certainty from them. Neither suffering nor violent death could ever lead them to abandon the truth which they have discovered in the encounter with Christ. That is why, to this day, the witness of the martyrs continues to arouse such interest, to draw agreement, to win such a hearing, and to invite emulation. This is why their word inspires such confidence. From the moment they speak to us of what we perceive deep down as the truth we have sought for so long, the martyrs provide evidence of a love that has no need of lengthy arguments in order to convince. The martyrs stir in us a profound trust because they give voice to what we already feel, and they declare what we would like to have the strength to express. A beautiful passage from John Paul. My final point. I would argue that JP2 himself has been that kind of witness for us in the modern world, and for many people who are not even believers. He's shown himself to be a man who's open to truth, open to encountering people around the world. His physical participation in pilgrimages to various countries, and unfortunately he wasn't physically able to do the Abraham to the Holy Land, to Egypt, to the Holy Land in the time of Jesus that he wanted to do, to really kind of recapitulate that pilgrimage of faith that we all are participating in to this day. But he wanted to do it. What I'm most surprised by in John Paul II, if I try to reflect on at this point in his life, what I'm still most surprised at, after admiring him and trying to follow him for the last 20 plus years, is the constant sense he has of starting fresh, of new initiatives, of, as he says, Jesus Christ being always the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, so that the new things that are for us to do in this moment, in the new millennium, are just as exciting and enthusiasm-provoking as they were for the apostles, if we know how to do it right, if we come into contact with that kind of truth. He says, and I'm going to just quote you one passage, "After the enthusiasm of the Jubilee, it is not to a dull, everyday routine that we return. On the contrary, if ours has been a genuine pilgrimage, it will have, as it were, stretched our legs for the journey still ahead." This is that guy who can barely, kind of walk along. He's feeling like his legs are now stretched and they are ready. So I would leave you with this final thought that John Paul II's response to the crisis of truth is, he wouldn't put it this way, but I would, his own life. John Paul II himself, the way he has been a philosopher, a leader, a spiritual pilgrim. And I like to put this to my kids this way, that there are some people who like to be like Mike. I think that they should aspire to be like JP.